Eisenhower proposed at the 1955 summit with the leaders of the Soviet Union an open skies policy. So in other words, both sides would be able to overfly. Why did the Soviets say no to that?
Well, the problem with the Soviets, is they were, to some degree, was that it was the emperor's, it was the emperor's clothes.
Yes.
The emperor didn't have any clothes. Here was Strategic Air Command, and everybody saying that the Soviet Union had this vast array of weaponry and nuclear weapons, but in fact they didn't. And you only had to talk to I talked to the guy who was the equivalent of the Soviet head of Bomber Command, who said, aircraft were terrible. We really couldn't take them anywhere. It would take us a day to load an atomic bomb into an aircraft. We just weren't in the same game. And we had a handful of bombs for a long while. They were incredibly unreliable. The aircraft were unreliable. So really, it was to hide their embarrassment that they took. They didn't want the world to know they didn't have anything, because they liked the idea that. It was suited. That's one of the things that LeMay and all these people. Saying, oh, the Soviets have all this equipment. It's what they were playing straight into the Soviets' own political game, because if it was better for the Soviets not to try and cooperate to maintain their apparent appearance of being militarily superior. In fact, the opposite was true. I'm not saying, for instance, that the Soviet army was enormous. The Red Army was vast,
absolutely. Yeah.
But actually, in terms of nuclear-capable aircraft and weaponry, Strategic Air Command we've never seen. Even today,
never seen an air force that large.
Never seen an air force that large with the ability to turn the planet into basically an iceberg.
Yeah,
it remains extraordinary.
And what spy flights did the Soviet Union carry out?
Well, the Soviet Union really couldn't carry, because they didn't have the equipment. And what they used to do is they would send their bears and bisons heading towards England, and then but they never flew over, because, they would be intercepted by the RAF or the US Air Force hundreds of miles off of the coast, and they wouldn't have, if they'd gone over the international, they wouldn't have had a chance, quite frankly. They just weren't. The Soviets were still using propeller bombers at a point when the US Air Force was entirely using very, very, very fast, powerful jets, and that's so
they couldn't match it.
Couldn't match it. So the Soviets weren't in this game. They were right on tactical stuff, but strategically they just couldn't play.
At the end of the Cold War, a joint US-Soviet commission was set up to investigate whether there were any surviving American airmen. What did it find?
Well, it didn't really find any surviving airmen. I think the truth of the matter is it tried to find some people, what happened to some people, and I think it did locate where some people, roughly who had died, in what circumstances, which I think is a bit of the American public and its relationship between its servicemen is different from, for instance, the UK. There's a much greater emphasis on the returning of bodies back to the United States, and they don't like leaving them in the places where they're killed. And also there's a much more emphasis on the notion of closure, that the relative must know what happened and the circumstances. And I think that commission helped them find a lot of those kind of, this is what happened to your son, your brother, your husband.
And in some cases found remains.
Often charcoal bones at a crash site. What was interesting more around the Korean War was that I remain convinced to this day that the Soviets captured a number of Americans and took them back to the Soviet Union for interrogation. There were a couple of very senior American pilots who I think went back and gave a good deal of information. I came across a large number of Chinese interrogation reports where Russians have been involved and they've gone back to Russia. Very, very detailed accounts from pilots. And there were all these stories about which the Commission investigated into people being seen taken on in trains back to the Soviet Union. And I think that did probably happen in a small number. And and I think some of them actually came back and were released.
Yes.
I think some people were just eliminated.
Yes.
And there were stories of people people who appeared to be Americans in Siberian prisoner, or well, not prisoner, in the Gulag, very late on, but very hard to pin down.
Yeah. So there was never the shock discovery of somebody who had been.
No. I mean, when I was making this series of films, because there were 3 in all, we were trying to see if we could track down, someone who might still be in the Gulag almost, that had been, but it never happened. And we think that certainly some people were there, but it was very, very hard to piece together.